be. We're here to talk about education, technology, and entrepreneurship in the future in all three sectors. I have the pleasure of being here today with Ron Reed, executive producer of South by Southwest Education, a longtime educator and a serial entrepreneur in both the learning and technology space. I thank you for being here today. Yes. I'm also here with Alexandra Samuel, who's a writer and researcher for the Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, as well as having done some recent significant research in the area of parenting and technology tool decision making. So thank you both for joining us this morning and for joining IEEE.
Happy to be here. That's great.
Thank you. So let's start actually with South by Southwest Education, since that just recently ended and we're now in the other areas of South by Southwest. Can you tell us some of the big highlights, especially in the technology and in the entrepreneuring education sector that went out?
Yeah, by all means. First of all, again, happy to be here. South by Southwest EDU concludes the day before Interactive begins. So we enjoyed having, I don't know, maybe 7,000 innovators from all over the world here to talk about the future of teaching and learning. So we enjoyed it. But yeah, I think a number of fun developments at the event. A few that come to mind that perhaps of interest to your audience as well, Randy, were a few speakers we had and some of the work that they did. One of our keynote speakers this year, for instance, was Aya Badir. Aya is the founder and CEO of an organization many of your folks will recognize called Little Bits.
Mm-hmm.
They do some fascinating circuitry work for kids to be able to build and really engage in making, if you will. Aya announced really a classroom component designed to really help take that into a classroom context. And additionally, to my recollection, the module was renamed STEM for, of course, science, tech, engineering, and math, but additionally integrates art. So it's a STEAM component for Little Bits. So we were really pleased to help support and host that at South by EDU. We also had another fun speaker, Jane McGonigal from the Institute of Play. Jane actually piloted and trialed a futures game with the audience, both present and virtually at South by EDU, that looked at sort of the future of earning and learning and sort of education as an economic development initiative. And so, so I think both of those are big trends, both the maker movement, how to really capture students' imagination and engagement, but also education to what purpose in terms of economic development, personal support, those sorts of things were big topics at South by EDU this year.
How's that for an incredibly solid overview? I actually want to get back in just a few minutes to talking about STEAM and play. But Alex, if you could take a moment of just telling some of the people of the great research, so we can also talk about that you've been doing in parenting decision making.
Sure, absolutely. Over the past couple of years, I have surveyed a little more than 10,000 North American parents to talk with them really about how they navigate this space, because I think the challenge that many parents and educators face now is that, we're obviously raising and educating children to live in a highly technologized world. But, for most of us, we're the first parents, we're the first, generation of educators who've really had to engage with the role of technology in our kids' day-to-day lives. And it's turned out to be an area where parents are deeply divided. And so we have, really three different worlds of parents, some who are what I call enablers, who are really letting their kids kind of set the tech agenda. We have limiters who are really trying to minimize their kids' use of technology. And then we have mentors who are trying to encourage, but also really guide their kids' use of technology. And when you have those three different types of parents, sending their kids to the same school or the same after-school program, you have some kids who are, coming to middle school already knowing how to code in, C#, and you have some kids who are coming to middle school and have never been allowed to touch a computer. And that poses an enormous challenge for educators. And in 10 years, it's going to pose an even greater challenge in the workplace, because you're going to have people who have such varying attitudes and skills in terms of working together and working online.
So that leads me to a great question. Before we started this event, we did discuss in IEEE Collaboratech what we wanted to ask people in the education space, and specifically edupreneurs in technology, what might be some of the important things to discuss here today. Before I go into my first question, I do want to let those viewers worldwide know that if you have questions that you want us to ask as we get into this discussion, that if you're watching on IEEE TV, please use the IEEE TV tool. The Google Plus tool, you can use the Google Plus, Hangout on air feedback. And if you're on Twitter, please use hashtag N3XT. But in the meantime, one of the first questions that we got on Collaboratech last week when we said we were going to be doing this session was specifically about stakeholders. right? So you discussed a little bit about the different kinds of stakeholders, that roles that parents play. And I know that you're a longtime educator in the educator space. When technology entrepreneurs are looking to develop their product, how do you advise that they should bring the stakeholder community into the decision making about how they're going to release, how they're going to scale their product and how they're going to grow as a company? Because there's so many stakeholders in the education space.
Yeah, fundamentally, that's kind of at the heart of what South by Southwest EDU or South by Education does, is really try to provide a platform to sort of convene the diverse stakeholders in the space. So a lot of K-12 and higher ed, policy folks, parents, increasingly students, certainly a mountain of entrepreneurs and others in the sector. I think, my observation, again, I've had the good fortune of being involved with a few different startups. I think sometimes technology creates capabilities and proficiencies that as developers we're seduced by. I think that in a very short day of learning and instruction, the classroom educators' priorities are exceedingly high. There is not a great deal of time to master many of these rich capabilities. So I think a lot about, certainly in my experience, the importance of really huddling with end users, those who are implementing the product at an early age with it, or at early phase of it. So I think you can't underscore or diminish the level of educator dialogue in the development process, and sort of the messaging, the marketing, the implementation, the use models. And I think that's true, be it from an enterprise solution to really a curricular and instructional application as well with it.
And that's actually really fantastic advice for any entrepreneur, regardless of whether they're in the education space or not, to make sure that they involve the stakeholders and, of course, that they do their research. Do you want to add anything, Alex?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think about this as a researcher, and the research I've done around parents has been based on online survey research, and I would say there's two pieces of general advice for entrepreneurs. I mean, the first is, I think we are used to, in the usability world, doing kind of often observational research and letting people test interfaces, and that's great. But there's really a prior stage in the process that is, trying to do large-scale market research, which is super easy now with the internet. And in the best case scenario, you're really building a community of customers and prospective customers who you're speaking to over time, so you get a picture of their needs. And balancing small scale qualitative research where you might have ideas that wouldn't come up otherwise, or even using social media monitoring to see, like, here are the issues for my potential market, but then going and talking directly to customers online and doing large enough scale research with hundreds, if not thousands, of potential users, so you actually know what your market is looking for. Because for example, in the parenting space, if you just base it on demographics or on the age of the child, you're going to miss some of the enormous differences between parents who are focused on providing a fun experience for their kids and parents who are focused on providing a learning experience. And they buy differently, they think about the space differently, and unless you understand those differences, you're just not going to be able to speak to them effectively or even develop the products they're looking for.
That's really great advice. I really appreciate that. We have another question from IEEE Collaboratech, and it's specifically about the difference between incorporating STEM and STEAM into their learning applications and developing lifelong learners at every stage of the game, not just elementary, but even us as adults. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the future of that transition from focusing just on science, technology, engineering, and math, and looking at how bringing arts into it? I know that you talked a little bit about that.
By all means, I think, first of all, there's a goodly body of research that with a rich arts initiative, academic performance is enhanced by that. And so I think that as I reflect a little bit on the focus on STEM skills, I think art really introduces an opportunity to broaden that construct quite a bit, from beyond the content to really some of the softer skills that we know in the world of work are ultimately fundamental to us with that. And so again, what I think Little Bits and Aya did by integrating into the circuitry strategies to embrace and elevate conversation about art helps make it more engaging, more relevant to young learners in ways that we find and believe are really powerful. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean,
Alex.
I think there's a really important gender component here as well. And, I wrote a piece about this last year for Ada Lovelace Day because I had observed with my own parents, I have a son and a daughter, and my son very much identifies as a techie, and my daughter really doesn't. And yet she is, by age 11, she was fully able to use Illustrator, build, with CSS and HTML, use Photoshop, wide range of video editing and image tools, but she didn't think of herself as a techie. And I have seen that pattern again and again with women as well in the tech industry. If you talk to people who are designers, they don't even describe themselves as technologists. And so I think it's really important to recognize that for some people, the focus is on the output, not necessarily the tool. And I think as a technology sector and as a community, it's really important for us to reflect back to girls in particular that, like, if you're making your art in Adobe Illustrator, yes, you're an artist and you also are a technologist. And I think for girls to get that feedback from an early age so that they see themselves as part of the tech world is so essential.
I know that was an issue for me growing up, so I appreciate that sentiment.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think we see a lot of equity issues rising prominently, girls with STEM and with coding, really girls internationally. We had a fascinating speaker who was responsible for education and development in Afghanistan who was talking about her work. And so I think there's really a global conversation going on about the importance of this.
That actually leads me to one of the other questions that we got via the hashtag N3XT before the event, which was, in general, when you talk about the global environment, there's a big emphasis on social good in education and learning technology. And one of the balances that anyone in a sector that's for social good or a social entrepreneur needs to consider is that balance between the desire to make a profit and actually the need to make a profit to survive as an entrepreneur. And of course, the balance of being a social entrepreneur and doing good for the world. And, is there a conflict in making money off of something that's like learning, which is so integral to human survival?
I'm going to defer to Alex initially on this, and I've got some thoughts I'll share as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny. So I worked in the nonprofit tech sector for many years. And, what we've seen in the nonprofit world is a shift in kind of the opposite direction, which is, a lot of nonprofits recognizing that they need to get beyond the donor or funder model in order to be sustainable. And so, for example, I worked with a wonderful organization called Plan, which works with families with children and adults who have mental illness or disability to help those adults live more independently. And when they looked at scaling their work, they used a software tool that we helped them develop to be able to extend their model. And they did it on a for-profit basis because that provides a source of revenue for the organization and allows them to be more sustainable. So I don't think I don't think we need to be embarrassed to make money. I think we look at this as sort of in a world of sort of triple bottom line. It really, in a way, doesn't matter. Are you an NGO or are you for profit? Are you funded by donors or are you funded by revenue? If you're able to develop a financial model that allows you to do something good in the world and doesn't make you dependent on foundations or government in order to keep that work going, that's awesome. And if you can also use that money to buy yourself a pool, I don't think you're going to burn in a hell if you've also succeeded in doing good things for kids just because you swim every day.
Well said.
Yeah, no, I think I'd agree. I mean, certainly we see a lot of innovation fueled more by heart and spirit than by bottom line. But I think fundamentally, the horse is out of the corral as it relates to the commercialization of public education space, resources, materials, schools. And so I think the extent to which organizations bring attention and awareness and support for that. For instance, I became familiar with an organization called Curriculum Associates that is what they describe as a some profit company as opposed to a nonprofit company. But again, kind of a triple bottom line. They have a need to be a sustainable business to support a growing customer base, but they do so with passion and with thoughtfulness about it. And I think in general, that's there is a heavy weight for organizations that are in the for profit in the space to be attentive to that.
Well, it's interesting. There has been some research by both the UN Foundation and the Case Foundation about the fact that entrepreneurship in specific sectors is what spurs sustainable change, right? And that, charity can help to kickstart it, but entrepreneurship, especially locally in continents like Africa, where you have local entrepreneurs creating the technology, creating the learning, and then self-sustaining themselves, that's how we make real long-term change. Okay. So we do have another question online, which is that, especially in the United States and in Europe, there's a growing trend from students at all ages, both in the elementary, believe it or not, as well as you go all the way up into college and lifelong learners, of moving from a 1-to-3, 1-to-1 ratio of one piece of technology, a desktop or a laptop computer, to 1-to-3 in the student level, right? Where they have a desktop, they have a laptop. I mean, they have a laptop, they have a mobile device. I'm here with questions on a mobile device, right? And then they might also have a tablet, and soon they might have Google Glasses or whatever next new technology where they're going to be getting their information, processing their information. So if you're in the technology learning space and you have an idea you want to launch, or a platform you want to launch, where do you start? Which platform do you go with? Do you start with mobile, and then how do you make decisions on where to go and where to scale?
I think it's not dissimilar to our earlier observation about sort of customer input. I think there's a lot of definition based upon who you're endeavoring to engage with the program. If you are a tech curriculum product at an elementary school level, iPads are probably a pretty compelling, tablet and platform to develop on. I think if you are, as we've been meeting a number of startups on the continent of Africa, it's a very mobile-centric experience and development. And of course, if you're working with, sort of enterprise and school district and institutional customers, the desktop's not irrelevant. I think in general, what we see is a recognition of my target market, what platform are they on?
Right.
And B, ultimately the desire for technology to be transparent and irrelevant about this. If it is a function of a student accessing it on a tablet or a desktop in the classroom, or accessing it on their mobile device as they're on the bus ride home, I think most content providers, in my mind, look at how do they get to really supporting multiple platforms, which of course is not an easy task, especially for startups in the space as well. So that'd be at least my observation.
I kind of want to bookmark March 14, 2016 is the day we declared the desktop to be not irrelevant.
And Pi Day, by the way.
All righty. Yes,
That's right.
exactly. I'm
That's
sure
right.
there's some meta there. So, I mean, it's a funny thing, right? Obviously I totally agree with what you're saying around, the research and understanding, what your users have access to. The flip side of that, I think, as well, is that, part of these platforms is we're cueing kids about which environments are appropriate to different tasks. And I think even as adults, we're not necessarily always very realistic or sophisticated about that. But I think that particularly when you're looking at young people, you really want them to sort of think about the fact that there are certain kinds of contexts where, mobile is going to be the right interface and the right context for them to engage. So for example, any sort of video or camera kind of application, that's going to be, the right tool for the job. And conversely, I think if you want students to engage in like a sustained task that requires concentration, you actually want to cue them to be on a device with a keyboard, particularly if you're trying to encourage literacy and not like, let's communicate everything via video. I say ironically on camera. And so I do think that in our rush to mobile, which is often driven by the recognition that that's, the most widely accessed platform, we sometimes lose that role we have as parents and educators of teaching kids that actually, like, sometimes you need to put down your phone and even, do as I say, not as I do, close your other windows and focus on a single activity.
Yeah, it's interesting to me as well, even as we're here at South by Southwest, a number of people I've bumped into who are walking with their phones in front of them, that sort of thing. To your point,
Right.
there are kind of opportunities to engage that shouldn't be missed as well. I think the other thing that I'd highlight is, we speak as if access to all of these devices and their connectivity is a given, and that's not
Absolutely right.
honestly the case.
Yeah.
In fact, I had the good fortune of being invited to a press announcement during South by EDU the governor was making regarding an initiative with Education Superhighway to permit greater broadband access to schools. As an example, the state of Texas has perhaps 1,100 school districts across the state, many of whom are in West Texas with no great connectivity. There was a press article recently about two students in McAllen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley, going to their school building late at night to do their homework because they could ride on the Wi-Fi there.
Right.
So I think as a sector, supportive of innovation and technology to power it and drive change. I think, again, some of the basic building blocks of access and connectivity or something, they're pretty fundamental to keep in mind as well.
It's a good opportunity to segue into what we were talking about earlier about the difference between, people, communities that are learning in a village environment, communities that are learning through a public school system, through a private school system, or even the challenges of homeschooling and how technologists can deliver product and services that might help in that space. Do you want to talk a little bit about that challenge?
Yeah, and I mean, and I should say that my entry point into the homeschooling world was as a parent. And, I mean, there is, engineers of the world, there is a huge market opportunity there. I mean, it's unbelievable because it was amazing to me as somebody who's worked in the tech world for a long time when I kind of plugged into the homeschooling universe, because on the one hand, it's very technologized because you have, an enormous number of kids who are accessing distance education.
Yeah.
But, really with very few exceptions, and I obviously have to note the Khan Academy is sort of the leader in that area, like the kind of the actual technology and the interface of most homeschooling stuff is like flashback to the 90s. Like, it's unbelievable how, both like technologically and visually primitive a lot of these sites are. And so I think, again, as homeschooling grows, and it's growing for very different reasons. And again, it's a very divided market, and you really would make a huge mistake to think of homeschooling as one thing, because there's at least three very distinct types of homeschooling parents. There's a large religious community. There's a large kind of what's called unschooling movement of people who are basically like against school as a construct. And then there's a very large number of parents who are like me, who basically like are fell into homeschooling because the school system didn't work for our kid. And those markets have very different needs. And yet, there's enough overlap that I think for people who are in the learning space, if you aren't succeeding in making your way into the institutional education world, where there often are a lot of like regulatory obstacles or existing players and large contracts, that actually the homeschooling market is much more open and very highly networked. And so the word of mouth gives you incredible opportunities. And really, it is not a tough competitive market, because with the exception of Khan, a lot of what's out there is pretty limited.
Thank you very much for that. So in other words, our engineers that are looking to do a startup, they should look for opportunities in the space that is not necessarily traditional education at all age groups. So that also, yesterday there was a session that IEEE sponsored with the Bushnell family. It's referred to by Fast Company as the first family of fun. And they talked a little bit about the fact that traditionally we used to learn to read, so that we could read to learn, especially in the traditional school setting. We do a lot of reading to learn. And that the future of education is more about learning to make, so that we can make to learn. And the maker movement being an integral part of making sure that we really instill that love of STEM to the future market, to the future generations, especially because they need to be involved and understand technology at a very visceral level to be successful. So can you talk a little bit about how play is going to be critical to the future of education, technology, and of course, making that sustainable by through startup and through innovation in large companies?
Sure. A couple of thoughts. One, I think the maker movement has really been embraced, and we've been happy to kind of champion it at South by Southwest EDU as a means of, frankly, introducing it to more traditional and classic educators the relevance and merit of integrating that into your schooling environment from what had earlier been more of an after-school program. So we see a lot of discussion embracing really how to integrate that into a more traditional learning experience. I think for me, I'm struck with the trends that we're seeing at South by Southwest EDU as it relates to maker, to coding, to the arts integration. I think there's a bit of a reset going on nationally as it relates to, for a decade or more, we've been focused on kind of high stakes assessment, academic achievement, really evaluating the data and scores as a result. I think that given its implication for really driving instruction rather than measuring outcome on it, that as there is a bit of a reset going on, there is an attentiveness to appreciating where learners are, what are their innate interests, and how do we leverage those to engage them in learning and really build upon that instead of looking at students as sort of vessels to be filled with this kind of content knowledge. So I think the maker movement is one of many examples of really a revisioning of the teaching and learning process that really respects and elevates the learner and looks at how do we design learning that is really impactful in that respect. And so as I say, I see it really from gaming and coding and making all across the board. And it's frankly a really refreshing opportunity. The other quick aside I'll share with that is that I think increasingly in the education reform thinking, as opposed to how do you nibble at the exterior of an institution to correct it, there's this sort of willingness to engage with a learner to really begin the process of designing the learning experience from them as opposed to the structure of learning. So, pardon.
Yeah, no, I was just going to, because real quick, you talked earlier about how do we redesign and how do we change the structure of learning. So one of the things that we were discussing yesterday was this fact that we sometimes talk about gamification as just earning points to do things. But one of the really amazing things about gaming is that there's an educational component where you move up levels, right? But the moving up levels isn't done by a test, right? So you talked about content acquisition, right? It's not content acquisition and proving you got that content, but it's that process of you do certain things. And as you do certain things, which is the maker movement, right? As you do certain things that's intrinsic to the process and the play of learning, you level up. Right. And so it's not that and you don't necessarily know as the player when you're going, what's going to get you that level up, unless of course you read the gaming guide, which is like reading the teacher's manual. But that whole process of how do we bring that leveling up concept into education. So you make it, from middle school to high school by leveling up and not necessarily by content acquisition proof through testing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So you had something where you were about to say.
Yeah, well, and I'm a bit ambivalent about this one
Okay.
because on the one hand, I've seen the rise of badging and certainly the power of leveling up kind of gamification as a motivator for a lot of kids. And I also worry about turning our whole world into a giant video game for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that we know from like kind of the child psychology world that when we've moved away from a sort of behavioral model of development to like a developmental model, moved away from the idea that like we train our kids like dogs with, a little pellet every time they perform their task, to trying to get at intrinsic motivation, which is more sustaining in the long run. And, anyone who's an entrepreneur knows that, starting a business is a long run game. And if you need your daily reward pellet, you're probably not cut out for entrepreneurship. And
Definitely not in the hardware space.
right, exactly. And so, my concern is that, gamification, game mechanics, the leaderboard, the badges, we are reinforcing a really reward oriented way of getting things done, a way of learning. And when what we need, I think, and then this is what I think is so great about the maker movement, is really helping kids tap into the intrinsic power of and satisfaction of creation, of service, of learning, And even though I think the gamification piece can be hugely helpful in getting kids started, I think we need to look at it as training wheels and try and take that away, and move them into learning and doing and creating for its own sake.
Yeah, I think I would agree. Again, the sort of intrinsic rewards associated with learning, I think, again, I spend a lot of time thinking about really how does this get to be. Learning is not something that occurs in an institution. As adults, we are constantly learning. South by is itself a learning experience. I mean, I'm really intrigued with this definition of learning as a lifestyle, as opposed to learning as something that happens between 8 a.m. and 2:30 p.m., 5 days a week, 9 months of the year, 145 or 80 days of the calendar year. And so I think the training wheels, to your aspect, to your observation, is really kind of creating this sort of intrinsic reward system that I'm interested as a learner in those things that engage me, and I have the freedom and opportunity to pursue them independent and above and beyond school. Is a conversation that we're really enjoying exploring as well.
Okay, cool. So one of the things that that we've touched on a little bit is this idea that in terms of lifelong learning, that we learn differently at different stages in our lives, right? So as students, we might, as parents, start with our young children, teaching them a certain way and expecting a certain behavior. And there is a different way that we need to approach adults. So what advice would you give to, to entrepreneurs that are looking specifically to engage those lifelong learners, to engage adults in the space where they might be difficult for them to want to learn a whole new tool, to learn a whole new system, right? So how do you get them to commit to the time to learn a new tool so that they actually want to learn off from you?
I'm gonna let you take that one.
Well, I think learning has to be relevant, first of all, and so I've been intrigued. We've hosted a number of conversations about sort of the unbundling of higher education, the rise and advent of MOOCs and massively open online courses. I think in some ways I'm more intrigued with MOOCs about great red wines from California, more so than introduction to coding. So I think when we begin to look at learning again, more richly from an adult construct, not only about accessing more richly their career, segueing their skills paths, et cetera. I think learning has to be seen as this collaborative pursuit that ultimately begins with my launch pad as a learner and the opportunity to pursue that which is personally of interest to me. And so if there is an informal course on movies of Robert Rodriguez that engage me as an adult and I have a learning experience with that, then I think I'm clearing a hurdle about learning that opens up more learning opportunities for me, both in and out of my career space with it. So I'm kind of intrigued with, again, this unbundling of learning that we're seeing disrupted at the higher ed level a little bit through badges, through online, so forth. I think that's going to continue to migrate down to younger learners as well. And I think that would probably be a constructive and positive thing. The more rich learning options there are for all of us as adults, as youngsters, and the earlier opportunities we have to engage and experience success, I think fuel continued pursuit of that would be a quick observation anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I'm really conscious of, again, the more I delve into the early education or school education space, is that obviously people have really different learning styles, and that has really started to transform at least the conversation about education, if not by and large the practice of education. Right? We know we have auditory learners, we have visual learners, we have people who are more structured learners, people who are more self-directed learners. And yet, I think often for economic reasons, a lot of the learning resources that exist for adults, and typically in kind of contexts, and I think in particular around software, right? I mean, an awful lot of adult skill acquisition happens in the course of tech support, basically, right? You're learning to use a new piece of software, you're learning to use a new website or what have you. And I guess I would like put out a plea to the entrepreneurs of the universe to recognize that not everybody wants their documentation in the form of a video. And I mean, it's really fascinating to me that we've had this shift, and we've almost kind of come to define, learning and continual learning through video. TED is sort of the paradigm, the TED videos. And so when we talk about people doing distributed learning, ongoing learning when they're watching videos, but if you're reading an article or reading a book, it's just reading. And those are both forms of continuous learning. And for some people, the visual piece of watching a video is very powerful. For other people, it's easier to absorb it and read it. And I think that even though it does mean investing in more content creation, ideally, if you're trying to deliver complex content, you need the videos, you need the written content, and you also need, I think a very important piece of education is the conversational interpersonal piece. That's often how people digest and sort of make sense, is through interaction with other learners or users. And so providing ways for that experience to happen, ideally in real time, is very powerful. And yet often we sort of take the shortcut by only offering it in one form.
Well, wouldn't that explain, the effectiveness of tools like the Rosetta Stone and technology companies that have really made sure that they integrate, verbal, auditory, and of course, experiential learning in that interaction. The social interaction is a huge space there. So we do have a complicated question that's come online that I think is really fantastic. So I'm going to read this one to you. So several organizations, and this is good for both large tech companies and small, several organizations like Apple, Discovery, and Google have used selective programs to highlight their stakeholder users and teachers and educators. For example, the Apple Distinguished Lecturers, the Google Certified Innovators, Discovery Education Network. So specifically rewarding and integrating the stakeholder, educators into the process of delivering to the actual consumer end of the education tech. So what advice would you give to smaller companies looking to use this model? And do you think it's an effective model for engaging stakeholders?
Yeah, for my part, I do. I mean, I think of it in many ways more as a mentoring initiative than another. I mean, I recognize and respect that there are brand build and alignments associated with that, but I think so much of teaching is really an art as much as a science, and I think the collaboration of folks who do it well and the dissemination of best practices. We functionally built South by Southwest education on top of that general model that
Right.
there are proficiencies some share that given the opportunity to empower others can help move the needle more broadly. So I think it is an appropriate and has proven to be I think a really successful model at least in the education sector with that. So I almost liken it more to a mentoring than really a corporate or brand representative model would be my observation with.
I mean, I think my only piece of advice would be, we often on the internet get really into our kind of rock star obsession, and you get really obsessed with sometimes even paying big bucks to have somebody who has big Twitter following or big brand following. And yet I think all of us know that you come to a conference like this one, and yeah, you might wait for an hour in line to see somebody who's like super rock star, and it might blow your mind. But you can also walk into a 50-person room with somebody who you've never heard of, who is amazing and inspiring and doing great work. And so I would just say, if you're looking for those people who are going to engage your audience, look for the human being who is passionate, who's inspiring, who's articulate, who loves what they do, and do not worry about whether they're like world famous.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I mean, we love elevating the voice of practitioners at South by Southwest, I think broadly, but certainly at EDU as well. I think, the experience and the sharing that can result from that is ultimately what is really, really empowering. I will say though, one of the things about South by Southwest EDU is, we would love to celebrate education professionals the same way our brand embraces new tech inventors, film and media types, rock and rollers, through music, film, and interactive. I mean, we see educators as creative artists, the same way as we do in these other sectors. And that's one reason we're so excited to be able to host the event and have been so pleased to see it grow so well. Is we think that as a sector, this community should be held in high regard. And if we can lend our brand and platform to really championing and helping elevate that, that's something that we're proud to do.
So we talked a little bit right before the session, and one of the things that we talked about was the future students coming into both the higher education and the workplace, and how can technology companies leverage those students and what they expect from their collaboration. And we talked a little bit about traditionally, at home, kids learning mechanical engineering and civil engineering to a certain extent from Legos, right? From the foundations of building very strongly. And that there is an entire generation in some countries, but globally definitely, collaborating online with tools like Minecraft, which are, give them that access to basic building blocks, but also doing it collaboratively across the world. So I know that we wanted to talk a little bit about the influence that's going to have on, how people learn, how people need to be in that kind of environment. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I think the first thing is you need to start by redesigning your office so that all the furniture is, a perfect cube, so that your employees feel comfortable in the environment. It is really an astonishing thing. The, majority of kids, under 12 now play Minecraft. We sort of 5 to 12 play Minecraft. Sorry, I should say that was in North America. And, the impact that has on not just their technical and collaboration skills, but their specific experience and the way that they encounter that is profound. And so the upside is that you are going to have a workforce that has a large number of people coming into the workforce with significant experience from an early age with online collaboration that they take very seriously. And I should say, it's funny, when I do workshops with parents, one of the things that parents complain about very frequently is the problem of how, when you want to end screen time and your kid says, I can't end right now because I'm on a team and we're doing, capture the flag or whatever in Minecraft, and I can't leave because I'll be letting my team down. And this drives parents crazy. But actually, if you think about it as an employer, you want those kids. You want those employees who were the kids who would not let the team down and would rather, end up with no dessert than let down their teammates by showing up at the dinner table on time. And so I think that we are in some respects cultivating tremendous, not just technical, but social and collaborative skills among these younger people. The thing to be aware of, looking forward, is that, these three types of parents that I described, the enablers, the mentors, and the limiters, are raising kids who will have radically different depth and levels of sophistication around technology. So you have kids who are basically feral as far as the internet is concerned. Like, they have been released into the wild with unlimited access from a very young age, have had some really, it's quite shocking what happens. I mean, my 8-year-olds have encountered it's not even what I would consider hate speech. I remember, being on a Minecraft server and somebody was building a swastika in their collaborative build, right? Like, some freaky stuff goes on. So you have kids who are having these, very problematic experiences online with no parental supervision from a young age. Then you have a third of parents who are really severely limiting their children's technology access, particularly in the early years. And then you have parents who are teaching their 8-year-olds, I don't know anyone who would do this, but teaching their 8-year-olds C#. And, when you get those three groups into the workplace in 10 years, they're all going to have to sit down in the same meeting, and they're all going to have to use the same office messaging platform, and they're going to have some pretty radically different approaches to interacting and working together, as well as very different levels of technical skill. And I don't think we are, we've already just been through this transition of like, oh my goodness, my office is full of millennials who use Facebook. Well, actually, of course, they don't use Facebook, they use Instagram. And now we're going to end up with, I think, an even more challenging situation where we have three groups of people coming into the workplace who have essentially clashing cultures when it comes to working together online and offline.
Yeah, I think the evolution of the learner is kind of fascinating. I mean, I think about my own experience, and I think about those of my children and youngsters today with it. And I think to your point, there is a skills attribute of online collaboration that's kind of fundamental to the go forward in the world of work and learning above and beyond that. I also tend to think that for me, as I think about education as a cultural movement, yet with this really hyper local layer on top of it, that it's through that sort of online collaboration that permits us to access both the nuance of my moment and my space and time, but in the construct of a larger community. So I think, again, as the evolution of learners proceeds, the whole dynamic of what's possible becomes really pretty fascinating too.
Thank you. So this has been a really fascinating conversation, and I know we're going to be tying it up and ending very soon because we're running out of time. But I did want to give one last pitch that if you have any questions you want us to ask, you can hit on Twitter. You can do hashtag #B-N3XT. You can also use the Google Plus platform, or of course, we're live on IEEE TV as well. In the meantime, if for questions as a follow-up, I want to make sure that that you all know Alex Samuels. You can find her on Twitter.
Yes, I'm AW Samuel on Twitter and every social network, pretty much.
And as we said before, Alex is a researcher and a writer in this space, as well as in several other technology spaces for both the Harvard Business Review and the Wall Street Journal. And Ron Reed has been a educator for about over 30 years, a serial entrepreneur, and of course is an executive producer with South by Southwest Education. And how can people reach you, Ron?
Yeah, I'd welcome them. Hashtag is SXSW.edu, but my email is ron@sxswedu.com, and welcome your reaching out. Look forward to visiting with you.
So we have just a few more minutes left, and I wanted to say, is there anything else that you want to add that's specific to this audience? As we've talked about before, IEEE has over 430,000 members, or about 430,000 members in all over the world. And they are primarily, electrical engineers in every technology space. But education and lifelong learning is important to them personally, right, as stakeholders, and also, of course, those that want to work for learning environments. What would you say to them in terms of advice for their future?
I would say you were at the launch pad of a moment in time that I'm very happy for you to be at. I think STEM and the integration of arts is in the sweet spot of your organization, and it is rocket fuel right now in what's going on in learning. I think the second conversation that's going on in education that aligns so well with your work is education is not irrelevant to economic development in the future in the world of work. And so as employers, as an organization that is really building the future for the country and the planet, I think engaging in and embracing learning at an early age through STEM, through STEAM, through mentoring, through the spectacular FIRST initiatives that yours and like-minded organizations go through. I think, again, there's a moment in time for IEEE that I'm hard pressed to look back on historically and see another moment in time where you, as an organization, you have such relevance and ability to contribute to the conversation going forward. So that would be my take on it.
I think I would say two different things. The first is, as somebody who has been through that process of starting and running a business myself and in the tech space for a long time, those of us who are geeks, like seriously, there's nothing more fun for me than learning a new piece of software, and I would just spend my whole life doing that. And so I think that there can be a tendency for those of us in the tech world to think, even if we recognize the need to continually invest in our skills, to, always invest in our technical skills. Because, no matter how much you do, there is always so much more to learn, and you're always so conscious of like the things you don't know. And yet I will also say that as an entrepreneur, I have gotten probably more value out of the soft skill investments that I've made around management, around interpersonal communication, leadership retreats, and productivity practices. And so I would really challenge people in technical fields to think of as sort of at the very least a 1-to-1 ratio of time and money in terms of investing in offline conferences and sort of the human side of business as well as in the technical side. And then a totally, different, I guess, request I would make is that, again, when I speak to parents about mentoring our next generation of kids online and the importance of this mentorship model of actively encouraging kids to use technology and actively guiding them through technology, I hear from a great many parents who feel very overwhelmed by that process because they feel they do not have the technical knowledge and skill to do that work for their kids. And I've been very fortunate as somebody who's worked in the tech field for a long time to be able to recruit those mentors into my children's life when their technical skill exceeds my own. And those people who have those technical skills, this is partly a kind of pay it forward thing in terms of, playing that role in the lives of your friends' children and your nieces and nephews or the kids in your local school. But it also is, it isn't even that long run an investment. It's a medium run investment, because the work you do now, teaching young people some of these fundamental, not just technical skills, but like what you know about how to be a responsible member of the internet community will come back to you 100 times over in 5 years or 10 years when those are the kids you're trying to recruit. You want that next generation to be smart, to be sophisticated, to be sensitive in their online communication. And you have that opportunity as a technology leader to influence and help grow that generation of kids.
So we have 2 minutes left. Is there anything else that you want to add before we sign off?
I'm hard pressed to, other than we wish you were in Austin, Texas. We're having a good time at South by Southwest. The sun is shining, the sky's blue.
It's been a high
yeah,
energy week.
it has indeed. It has
Well,
indeed.
that's actually a perfect segue for me to talk about the fact that IEEE is going to come back to Austin, Texas. We're going to be here on September 17th and bringing our IEEE N3XT conference here to Austin. And we hope you'll be part of that. We'll be talking about education, entrepreneurship across all engineering fields. And we'll be also working together with a little bit of the stakeholders here in Texas, like yourself. And we hope to see you here in Austin on September 17th. This has been Randy Sumner for IEEE TV and IEEE N3XT. And I've been here today with Ron Reed of South by Southwest Education and with Alexandra Samuel, again, of the Harvard Business Review and of the Wall Street Journal. I thank you so much for your time. It's been a really fantastic